Daniel and Elise Whitaker were the couple everyone envied, until a single, anonymous letter shattered their picture-perfect life and exposed a secret so dark it had been buried for nearly 30 years. What began as a quiet suburban marriage unraveled into a nationwide manhunt, a murder trial, and a horrifying truth. Elise had unknowingly spent decades married to a man who didn't exist. For nearly 25 years, Daniel and Elise Whitaker had been the couple everyone admired. Their home sat at the end of a quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac. In Marietta, Georgia, a place where neighbors smiled, children played freely, and everyone seemed to know everyone. Daniel was a well-known architect who had designed half the town's municipal buildings, while Elise taught piano lessons from their living room, her music often heard drifting through the windows in the early afternoons. They had raised two children, now grown and living in other states, and together they shared what seemed to be an idyllic life, filled with travel, holiday gatherings, Sunday brunches, and thoughtful gestures that made others envious. In public, they were inseparable. In private, Elise believed their bond was even stronger. Everything began to shift with a phone call on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring. Elise had stepped out to pick up groceries and returned to find Daniel sitting motionless on the edge of the sofa, phone in hand, his face pale and eyes unfocused. When she asked if everything was all right, he offered a strained smile and told her it was just a work-related issue. He brushed it off and said he'd handle it. That night, he skipped dinner and locked himself in his home office, claiming he needed to finalize blueprints for a city project. Elise didn't push him. Daniel had always been a private man when it came to stress. She trusted him, as she always had. Over the next week, Daniel became increasingly distracted and distant. He would vanish into his office for hours, jump at unexpected noises, and check the front door more than once before going to bed. Elise assumed he was under pressure from a client or struggling with something he didn't want to burden her with. She tried to be supportive. She left his favorite meals by the door, played softly on the piano to help him relax, and gave him space. But deep down, something didn't feel right. His behavior was too abrupt, too paranoid. Daniel was acting like a man hiding something. A few days later, while sorting through mail, Elise found a letter with no return address. It had her name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a single line printed in bold black ink. "Your husband is not who he says he is." There was no explanation, no signature, no threats, just that one chilling sentence. She stared at the paper for minutes, her heart thudding in her chest. She thought it might be a cruel prank or some mistake. Still, she didn't tell Daniel. Instead, she quietly placed the letter in her bedside drawer, but the letters didn't stop. A second one arrived 2 days later, then a third. Each one revealed a little more. One claimed Daniel had changed his name in 1997. Another said he had left behind an entire life and someone else. The final letter included a photograph, a younger Daniel, maybe in his early 20s, standing beside a woman Elise had never seen before. They were holding a baby, smiling in a way that looked intimate, familiar. Elise stared at the photo for hours, trying to find answers in the faces, still unwilling to believe it. She searched their house. She began to go through Daniel's belongings when he left for errands. She opened drawers he rarely used, peeked into the back of their closet, and even examined the safe where they kept important documents. In a small, worn envelope tucked behind tax papers, she found something that confirmed her worst fear: a birth certificate with a different name, Stephen Carter, and a high school diploma from a town in Oklahoma she had never heard of. There was no mention of Daniel Whitaker anywhere in those papers. The shock left her physically ill. The man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, her partner in every decision, had an identity she never knew existed. She wondered what else he had hidden. Was he running from something? From someone? Had their entire marriage been a lie? That night, she sat in the dark living room, staring at their wedding photo on the mantel. Everything about their life had seemed so genuine, so deeply real. But now, even her memories felt corrupted. Elise felt herself slipping into a fog of disbelief and dread. She didn't know whether to confront him, report him, or simply run. All she knew for certain was that the perfect marriage she believed in had cracked open, and something dark was beginning to seep through. Elise couldn't sleep after discovering the documents. Every creak of the floorboard and rustle of wind, outside made her jump. For the first time in her marriage, she felt unsafe in her own home. She moved the envelope into her purse, zipped it tight, and locked her bedroom door that night. In the morning, Daniel acted as if nothing had changed. He made coffee, kissed her cheek, and left for work like always. But to Elise, every one of his movements felt like a performance. She kept glancing at his eyes, looking for cracks, something to show guilt or fear. But his face remained calm, almost too calm that by mid-afternoon, Elise found herself parked in front of the local police station, the engine running but her hands frozen on the steering wheel. She didn't know what she was about to do. Was she accusing her husband of a crime? Asking for a background check? When she finally stepped inside and explained the situation to the officer at the desk, her voice was shaking. She handed over the letters, the photo, and the documents. She didn't ask them to arrest him. She just wanted to know who he really was. The officer nodded, took the papers, and said he'd pass it on to a detective for review at it first. Elise tried to go back to her routine. She didn't tell her children. She continued teaching piano, attended church on Sunday, and even cooked Daniel's favorite stew that week. But inside, she was unraveling. Each day felt like walking through fog. Daniel's presence felt foreign. When he hugged her, she stiffened. When he laughed at something on television, it sounded hollow. She couldn't look at him without thinking about the name Stephen Carter and the baby in the photograph. Who were they? And where were they now? 4 days later, a detective called her back. He asked her to come in privately. She sat in a small, windowless room with a beige file in front of her and a soft-spoken man named Detective Harris across the table. What he told her shattered what little piece she had left, that Daniel's fingerprints, taken from the coffee cup she had left behind during her first visit, matched those of Stephen Carter, a person of interest in a missing persons case in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The name hadn't come up in years, but it was still flagged in the system. Stephen Carter had been the last known person to see a young woman named Lauren Field before she vanished in 1996. At the time, he was her boyfriend. They were seen arguing behind the diner where she worked. Her car was found abandoned the next morning. She was never seen again. The case had gone cold after a few interviews. Stephen claimed she had left after a fight, and without a body or clear evidence, the police couldn't arrest him. A week later, he left town. No trace of him was found until now. Elise sat motionless as Detective Harris spoke. She heard every word, but they felt far away. A woman missing for nearly 30 years. A man who changed his name and rebuilt his life. A husband who had possibly killed someone before he ever met her. She couldn't comprehend it. The man who tucked her in when she was sick, who taught their kids to ride bikes, who cried at their daughter's graduation. Was that the same man who disappeared after a woman went missing? Daniel was arrested early the next morning. Elise had gone to stay with a friend for the night and wasn't there when the police arrived. He was calm when they handcuffed him in the driveway. No shouting, no resisting, just a quiet acceptance. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the man they had admired for years was led away in the back of a patrol car. The media caught on within hours. Headlines called him the double-life husband. Photos of Elise and Daniel from Community events started appearing online. Reporters showed up outside the house, knocking on windows, demanding answers. Elise didn't give any. She packed a suitcase, left through the back door, and checked into a hotel under a different name. Nothing made sense. She couldn't understand how someone could live beside another person for so long while hiding something so huge. And the worst part was knowing the truth might only be beginning. The name was fake. The life was built on lies. But now the question looming larger than anything else was the most terrifying of all. Was Daniel just a liar, or was he something far worse? With Daniel behind bars and the past now cracked wide open, the investigation moved swiftly. Authorities in Oklahoma reopened the cold case of Lauren Field, a waitress who had vanished in 1996. For nearly 3 decades, her disappearance had haunted her family and puzzled local detectives. There had never been enough evidence to arrest anyone, but her last known companion, Stephen Carter, had always been the quiet suspect. His sudden vanishing act only fueled suspicions, but without a body, the case remained frozen in time. Until now, news of Daniel's arrest made its way to Tulsa, where Lauren's sister, Melissa Field, had never stopped searching. She had kept boxes of her sister's belongings, newspaper clippings, old voicemails, and dozens of pages of her own notes. After hearing the news, she contacted the investigators with something they hadn't seen, an old photograph of Lauren and Stephen, together at a county fair, taken just a few weeks before she disappeared. Side by side, their arms draped around each other. The man in the photo matched Daniel Whitaker's face exactly. There was no longer any doubt. Law enforcement obtained a search warrant and began scouring every trace of Daniel's past, both in Georgia and back in Oklahoma. Public records, bank accounts, phone logs, everything was combed through. Elise, meanwhile, remained hidden in a small rental cottage on the outskirts of town, watching the headlines unfold from a distance. She hadn't spoken to Daniel since his arrest and didn't respond when he tried to contact her through his lawyer. She couldn't. She had loved him deeply, but now even his voice felt like an intrusion. What else had he lied about? Was their life together just a careful disguise? Then came the break investigators had hoped for. While tracking financial data, authorities discovered that Daniel, using one of his old aliases, had been paying the rental fee on a storage unit in Tulsa for nearly 2 decades. The payment had been small, buried among various other transactions, but it was consistent and active. With the owner now in custody, the police gained access and opened it. Inside, they found relics from another life. Stacks of books, some men's clothing, a vintage wristwatch, and several photographs, many of which showed Lauren smiling in casual settings, a coffee shop, a park bench, a cluttered living room. There was also an old metal box filled with papers, letters, and receipts dated from the early 90s. But the most disturbing item was a large, faded blanket, balled up and stained. When forensic experts tested it, they found dried blood embedded in the fibers. DNA testing confirmed it matched Lauren's. The discovery triggered a new wave of public interest and media attention. Authorities now had enough evidence to charge Daniel not just with identity fraud, but with Lauren Field's murder. Prosecutors worked quickly to assemble their case. Though they still didn't have a body, the bloodstained blanket, the abandoned storage unit, the fake identity, and his sudden disappearance after Lauren's were enough to build a compelling timeline of guilt. Back in Georgia, Elise was visited by detectives again. This time, they asked about anything unusual Daniel might have said about Oklahoma, whether he had traveled alone at any point in their marriage, whether he had mentioned a woman named Lauren. But Elise had nothing to give. Daniel had been careful, too careful. He never mentioned Oklahoma, never hinted at another life. If he had returned to Tulsa during their marriage, he had done so under the radar. The only thing Elise could confirm was that every summer he took a solo trip to clear his head. She had never questioned it. Now she wondered if that time had been used to manage whatever secrets still lingered in that old town. As the charges piled up, Daniel was transferred to Oklahoma to await trial. The courtroom would be the final battleground for truth. Meanwhile, Elise continued to distance herself from the chaos. She changed her phone number, removed her wedding ring, and legally separated from Daniel. But no matter how far she tried to run, the story followed her. Friends no longer knew what to say. Strangers whispered. Every time she looked in the mirror, she wondered what signs she had missed. She questioned the past not in years or decades, but in individual moments. A smile, a hug, a pause in a conversation. Could something have warned her? Daniel had created a new identity and lived it so fully that even those closest to him never saw the cracks. He had buried his past, hidden it under charm, consistency, and the illusion of love. But the truth has a way of rising. And now, the question of what happened to Lauren Field was finally being asked loudly enough that silence could no longer be an answer. The trial began on a humid morning in Tulsa, where the courthouse buzzed with reporters, legal teams, and curious onlookers who had followed the story from the start. It had been nearly 30 years since Lauren Field vanished, and now, the man accused of ending her life sat calmly in a dark suit, hands folded, eyes scanning the room without emotion. The name on the docket was Daniel Whitaker, but to the people of Oklahoma, he would always be Stephen Carter, the man who ran. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case. They laid out a timeline of Lauren and Stephen's brief, volatile relationship, pointing to witness statements from former co-workers who recalled seeing bruises on Lauren's arms and a growing sense of fear in her voice whenever she spoke about him. They played the old voicemail recovered by Lauren's sister, an audio file nearly forgotten in a dusty attic. that hinted at Lauren's fear in her final days. "If anything happens," she had said quietly on the recording, "look at him. Look at Stephen." Next came the forensic evidence from the storage unit, the blood-soaked blanket, preserved for decades in silence. DNA experts confirmed that the blood belonged to Lauren, and the prosecution argued that it was the last remaining trace of her existence. The existence of the storage unit, they said, was damning. A secret space, paid for in cash, kept active. For decades, thousands of miles from where Daniel had lived his second life. Why keep such a thing hidden if not to conceal a crime? The defense, however, challenged every inch of the case. They claimed there was no body, no eyewitness, and no proof that Lauren had died at all. They suggested that the blood might have come from an injury or miscarriage and argued that Stephen's disappearance could have been motivated by fear of being falsely blamed. Their strategy was clear: cast enough doubt to make the jury hesitate. After all, doubt could mean freedom. Then, in a move no one expected, the defense called Daniel himself to the stand. Calm, articulate, and unnervingly composed, he told the jury a story of youthful mistakes, toxic love, and panic. He admitted to being Stephen Carter, but denied ever harming Lauren. According to him, they had a falling out. She left town after an argument, and he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He said he changed his identity because he feared being wrongfully arrested and wanted a clean slate. The courtroom listened in silence as he painted himself as a man haunted by the past, not guilty of murder. But the prosecution wasn't finished. In their final days of presenting evidence, they called a surprise witness, a retired private investigator, hired by Lauren's sister years ago. The PI had quietly followed Stephen Carter's trail until he hit a wall. But now, after reading about the arrest, he came forward with a diary entry from one of Lauren's friends who had passed away years earlier. The friend had written about a night when Lauren confessed she was pregnant and afraid of what Stephen might do if he found out. That entry, paired with the blood evidence and the sudden disappearance, formed a chilling picture of what might have happened as the trial came to a close. The jury was left with two versions of the story. One painted Daniel as a grieving ex-boyfriend who tried to escape suspicion. The other showed a calculated man who reinvented himself after killing someone who trusted him. The deliberation lasted 5 days. On the 6th day, the courtroom stood still as the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Daniel Whitaker, formerly Stephen Carter, was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as the words were read. He simply nodded, as though the outcome had been expected all along. Outside the courthouse, Lauren's sister stood holding a photo of her sibling, tears in her eyes but strength in her voice. "She was forgotten by the system," she said, "but not by me. Not for one day." Back in Georgia, Elise watched the sentencing on television from her small rental home. She didn't cry. The man she married was gone long before the gavel fell. Her grief had shifted into something else: resolve, perhaps, or the cold acceptance that she had loved a man who never truly existed. But even then, she couldn't escape the echo of his presence. Every detail of her life had been shaped by his deception, the home they built, the family they raised, the love she gave. And now, that life was over, dismantled not by violence or betrayal alone, but by a single, well-crafted lie that had reached across decades and destroyed everything it touched. Months after the trial, the story of Daniel Whitaker faded from the headlines. But for Elise, the consequences never quieted. She had returned to a world where everything was familiar yet poisoned. Her house, once filled with warmth, now stood empty and silent, as if it no longer recognized her. She spent most days walking the wooded trails behind her rented home, trying to make sense of what had happened, what she had lived through, and what she had unknowingly supported. The shame lingered like smoke in her lungs. People in grocery stores gave her pitying looks. Friends who once filled her calendar with dinner parties now avoided her altogether. She didn't blame them. After all, she had shared a life with a man who turned out to be a murderer. Then, late one afternoon, her phone rang. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code was from Oklahoma. On the other end was Detective Harris. His voice was calm, but the words he spoke reopened everything she had tried to bury. A construction crew had unearthed human remains near a wooded area just outside Tulsa, only 2 miles from the old diner where Lauren Field had worked. Alongside the skeletal remains were pieces of clothing, a rusted bracelet, and a delicate silver pendant engraved with the initials EW Elise Froze. The pendant had been hers, a gift from her mother when she turned 20. She hadn't seen it in over a decade and had assumed it was lost in a drawer or misplaced during a move. But now, it had been found buried in the same shallow grave as Daniel's first victim. The implications were devastating. This wasn't just a crime of the past. Daniel had revisited the grave during their marriage. He had returned to the scene while living with Elise, possibly wearing her jewelry, taking tokens, and reliving what he had done. Investigators confirmed the remains belonged to Lauren Field through dental records. The discovery gave her family the long-awaited closure they had never thought possible. A quiet memorial was held, where Melissa Field placed a framed photo of her sister next to a white wooden cross planted in the earth above her final resting place. The cold case was officially closed, but the emotional wreckage stretched far. Beyond the courtroom, Elise now lived under a different name. She sold the house she and Daniel had shared and donated nearly everything inside. Wedding photos, keepsakes, gifts, all reminders of a life built on deceit. The only thing she kept was her piano, which she moved into her small one-bedroom rental. She no longer taught lessons but played alone in the evenings, letting the music speak where words failed. She received one final letter from Daniel, sent from prison. She almost didn't open it, but eventually did, unable to resist knowing what he might say. The letter was written in the same neat script he'd used for years on birthday cards and anniversary notes. It wasn't a confession or an apology. Instead, it read like a farewell, detached, cold, and disturbingly rational. He wrote that he had lived two lives, and that the one he lived with her had been the better of the two. He ended the letter by thanking her for giving him peace he didn't deserve. Elise burned the letter the same day. There was no peace for her, not yet. Only the slow, painful rebuilding of her identity. In time, she began to write about her experience, not to relive it, but to release it. She wrote for women who had trusted, who had loved, and who had suffered for the lies they never saw coming. Her story was picked up by a publishing house, and her memoir, written under a pseudonym, became a quiet success. Readers were captivated, not by the crime itself, but by the woman at its center who had walked through the fire and emerged, not unscathed, but standing. Daniel Whitaker would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He had fooled everyone, even the FBI, for nearly 30 years. But the lie he used to build his perfect life eventually consumed it. In the end, the truth didn't just catch up with him. It dismantled everything he had touched. Elise still carried the weight of what she lived through. But she had also reclaimed her life from its ashes. The perfect marriage was a fiction, but the woman who survived it was very real and stronger than even she had known.